Hi, and welcome back to the Carbon Countdown podcast. My name is Ariana Saenz. This podcast is put together by students who are exploring topics that will shape their proposals for future design. Today, I'm here with Ilaria Mazzoleni, an architect, educator, and author of Architecture Follows Nature. Her work investigates how lessons from natural systems can inspire innovative and sustainable architecture. In this conversation about origins of her book, principles of biomimicry and design, and how these ideas can guide the next generation of architects and students like us. Thank you and welcome, Professor Mazzoleni.
Thank you, Ariana, for reaching out and inviting me to this podcast. I'm excited to spend some time with you.
So I'll give a brief summary on Architecture Follows Nature. Ilaria Mazzoleni's Architecture Follows Nature explores how lessons and natural world can be a guideline for more sustainable and resilient architecture. Drawing from biology, ecology, and design theory, she presents biomimicry not as a limitation of natural forms, but a deep study on how living systems function and adapt to their environment. This book is organized by examples from around the world that ranges from buildings and that mimics cooling systems of termite mounds to structures shaped and strength from shells or trees. Mazzoleni pairs these case studies with a clear design methodology that helps translate natural principles into practical solutions for architects. The book also shows how organisms evolve and respond to the environments that inspire buildings and cities to conserve energy and use materials efficiently and a better withstand climate. It serves as both a reference for professionals and a guideline for students seeking to integrate biomimicry into design. So we'll get into questions now. So
Yes.
the first question is, what first inspires you to write Architecture Follows Nature?
Yes, for many years I taught in at the university, at the School of Architecture, and I always thought that building systems that are integral part of our education as architects and fundamental to provide comfort to our living in structures um, required some more imaginative way of studying them. And because we are not engineers, right? We like technology, but we also want to approach building system from an imaginative and with some inspiration. And so I looked back at nature to see if I could get inspirations to then transfer to the students and with them develop ideas of architecture inspired by natural system processes, functions, and also form sometimes. So that was the initial inspiration to really help uh, students to find inspiration in how to design buildings that draw less energy to operate, to function, and to still provide comfort. And so the classes in biomimicry and bio-inspired design were born, and this book is kind of the result of those teachings and a formalization of how a method of how to approach the inspiration, because it's not just sitting under a tree that you get the inspiration, but is thinking of how to learn from a different discipline, from a different realm, to then apply it to our own, as we are also students and we are learning still, or as we are lifelong students, that we always learn something new. So that's how the book was born. And some of the applications and the case studies then that one sees in the book, most of them actually in part two, are case studies from students' work that after the projects was done, actually we revisited, they had graduated, and then we decided to do the book. And so I contacted them and I said, why don't we, work on creating a set of drawings and
Wow.
following a very clear structure that a book requires, right? It's not uh, classroom work is never ready to be published work. It's fair. But that's how we started the project that sees 12 case studies of different organisms that looks at how to thermoregulate, how to create water balance and humidity controls in buildings, how to communicate through colors in nature. You just told me that you come from Ecuador, right? And the forest, and we can learn so much from organisms living in the forest, the colorfulness. And architecture is most of the times quite black and white, right? Not so colorful. So maybe we could learn how to communicate differently by being inspired by colorful organisms. And then the protection is the fourth system that are all inspired by animal covers, by skins,
Right.
because the skin protects and connects us, similarly to what building facades are meant to do. And they are the first barrier and connector to the environment um, and from the environment. So this analogy brought us really to study organisms.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that they were students that were just like making like the actual drawings for publishing because it's very hard to take from like a design or like from a school aspect kind of drawings like you actually like don't really think about when you put it in a book. It's very different and the format has to look very professional and very edge to edge so it's cohesive with what the writing is also with connecting into like the book.
Yes, it took quite some time and, was inspired by those initial projects. And then both in the office and with some of the students' involvement, we systematize. I taught this bio-inspired design or biomimicry class for several years. So these were projects that could fit in the narrative of this particular book. So uh, but yes, that's possible with quite a bit of post-production work
Right.
that it takes anything to get to a publication.
And just like a follow-up question to this part, I'm just wondering how students decided on like an organism or like a living, like you were saying, like there's a part in the book where it's about polar bear skin and
Yeah.
how, like it's caused like insulation for them and like how like there's different layers to them.
Yeah, so the I started teaching this seminar in 2005, and I taught it at SCIARC, the Southern California Institute for Architecture, and is a school dedicated to architecture. So there were no biologist colleagues. So, but because the school and I live in Los Angeles, I reached out to colleagues and friends at UCLA, and they were biologists, ecologists. There was a lab studying mainly the tropics, in fact. And I asked them to come and teach some classes. So it's a true collaboration. In fact, the book is in collaboration with Shauna Price. Shauna is a genetist and entomologist. She studies ants. But basically, I would, in the first part of the semester, like in the first part of the book, introduce these ideas of learning from nature and also why architecture would benefit in learning from nature. And in these introductory classes, we would understand a little bit the processes of nature, first of all. And then we would discuss some possible organism that could be of interest to the subject of the class. So I would, in kind of confront or discuss previously with some biologists which organism I think that it could have been interesting, like the polar bear, which adaptations makes the polar bear live in the cold. Yes, they have a den, but the den is just for the cub and the mother in particular situations, right? The male polar bear just lives in the cold and has developed physiological adaptations to do so. And that's fascinating, right? Because a human needs layers to survive in a winter in the Arctic. So there must be something. So let's study what that something is, and with that we can get to find the inspiration. It's not that by looking at a picture you get the inspiration. Bio-inspired design or biomimicry is not looking at pretty pictures, is studying nature, right? So there is a depth that is necessary.
That's pretty cool. I wish I could have taken that class. I learned a lot more. So we'll get into the second question, which is how do you define biomimicry in architecture and what are common misconceptions of biomimic design?
So I define biomimicry, but it's not my own definition necessarily, but the way that I look at it, as others by now, is how to approach innovation in design, architecture, urban planning. I mean, design taught as at large, at the discipline at large, where innovation is inspired by the processes and functions of nature. So is not looking only but at the form of nature. Uh, Being architects, often, we think at form as integral part of our process, which is fair and is part of what we are, but is not exclusive. When it's exclusively looking at the form, we call it biomorphism or zoomorphism in the case of animals. Uh, the power of biomimicry is the ability to inform the design at a more fundamental level, influencing things like material choices, energy performance, structural integrity. So it really looks at the functions, which in nature functions and form are very, most of the time, tied together. And moreover, is processes, right? I'm fascinated by ecosystems. The Amazon forest, right, is an ecosystem. It's very difficult to take an element and analyze it by itself. As students of something, we need an entry point. I need the skin as entry point to study an organism, but then I'm very much aware that the skin is part of a body, is connected to other organisms. So I would say that the first learning lesson from nature is that everything is interconnected. And so that is really thinking holistically. But as learners, we always need to start somewhere. And so that's where we pick one element at a time. Otherwise, it becomes also very superficial look. And for me, biomimicry requires working with ecologists, biologists, with scientists. It's not just me by myself doing some Google search is not enough. It's too superficial. And reading scientific papers is the necessary step. But of course, again, as architect, I'm not equipped to understand the terminology, at least not at first. So I do need a true connection with the scientific world. And that's beautiful. It's really what is wonderful about collaborating with others.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it's not just obviously we have a group already with like the architects itself. There's already a group and we work in the field, but it's interesting that we have to also talk to scientists. It's like not always like the case like you hear that we work with scientists, but as you were saying, it's something very important because we're not scientists ourselves, so we obviously need help to read what they're talking about or like have them help us analyze even better or be a better study into what we're looking at. So that brings me into my third question, which is what advice would you give students or younger designers who want to integrate biomimic principles into their own work while contributing to the city?
Yeah, it's is what I was suggesting before, right? We need to collaborate, and architecture is a highly collaborative profession. It's rare that one person can do it all, not by now in the complexity. Also, buildings are really full of systems and of complex integration within the city systems and infrastructure. So it's by definition by now a collaborative profession. However, the expansion, if you want to bring biomimicry, you need to do additional research. And so we have to expand our collaborative team to include scientists. From the beginning, from the habitat, understanding the environmental context is fundamental. We don't build always in the same climatic condition. And if we are oblivious of that first step, then our buildings are never contextualized. I'm talking about environmental contextualization. So there is a little bit of this mind shifting. You need to change your mindset a little bit and be adaptive, like adaptable are the strategies of survival of many organisms, so that we can again not start with our predefined program based projects that, oh, I need to design a library, what do I need for the library only, but where is this library and how it's oriented and what is the weather and the climate. Some principles that were also not exclusive of biomimetic design. We have learned it also in passive system designs. They have roots in the past. It's not all new. Innovation is not 100% discovering something, is a stepwise. So the advice to the students is to be curious about other disciplines and to really be learners. Uh, I have nothing against the use of AI, but it's not sufficient. We can use it to tie together our thoughts, but first we need to develop our own thoughts. And thoughts develop only through reading, research, connections with other people. We need depth in order to innovate or do something a little bit different. We need to sit down and spend the time. It's not magic. So be patient, work iteratively. Is not one design, is not one sketch, is 20 sketches, and keep iteratively including, cleaning up, eliminating, and really think that we need regenerative communities. We need to think of other components to our design beyond the beauty of our building, which is fundamental. It makes a difference. A beautiful building, by a traditional way of saying it, is fundamental to the well-being of a city life, but is not enough anymore because we fill up these buildings with so many systems that requires energy, water, and more, that we need to be able to shift that, including biomaterials. I also want to suggest to look more and more into materials and to non-toxic materials, so materials that have a biological kind of, let's say, background and remains as such, so that when we dismantle buildings are not toxic. I think your generation really needs to start looking seriously on new materials, of groups of materials that are not toxic. So yeah, sorry, are many suggestions.
No, it's all good. I also realized that biomimicry also ties into bio, like materials itself. So it's just a lot of research. And like you said before, it's just a ton of research. And once you think you got one segment of what you're thinking about, it's like a whole nother like segment of something like you just never touched or never thought that you were gonna look at because you're like looking at one thing when you're an architecture student, you just focus on that one thing and then you don't see like there's like a whole nother like other things that you can find out and that can help you throughout like the whole like design or even for like architects they figure out like there's other things far into like architecture itself, not like just like natural systems or like scientific like you were saying, but it's just like a lot of more research that comes along, not just structure and trying to make it look very nice from the outside as we were saying. So this leads me into my fourth question and my final question, which is where do you think biomimic architecture is headed in the next decade?
Well, I think the materiality for me has been always interesting because that's what, when I was your age, I was studying biomaterials already. So it's not something new. Or I was studying life cycle analysis, where materials come from and where they go. Not yet concentrating my attention to biomaterials, but I would say that we have evolved a lot, but we haven't shifted completely and is really necessary. So it's a demonstration that are lifelong processes of shifting. And so I encourage that to really think that biomaterial sciences are really important, not isolated, of course. They are aided by computational design and all these other components, but is not by itself that BIM or BIM is going to solve the construction industry, not from an environmental perspective, which is the one that I'm caring for. So I hope that in the next decade, we can continue to focus into environmental issues, because I always say we can be rich, we can be living in a beautiful house, but if we cannot breathe the air that we need to breathe because it's polluted, what do we do with all that money, right? And it's not so absurd as I thought, because we saw during COVID, right, the difficulties we all face that went beyond us. So sometimes the challenges are so great that come really from our environmental behavior. So I think biomimetic architecture, bioinspired architecture, looking at the environment and at the sciences, is going to be continuously more and more, increasingly more and more important for our profession. And not just because the code requires that, but because we want to live a healthy life as human, and that requires thinking that all organisms needs to live a healthy life, because we are not isolated ourselves, right? We are part of a system.
Right.
So I think that there is a lot still to do. It is a young discipline in architecture, but is integral to really the well-being of buildings and then cities. And so I think this is really important, and also it will show the necessity of being collaborative more and more. As young students, you will rarely work independently after you go out, right? And so learning to work with others is something also quite complex as humans. So that those are a couple of things that comes to my mind.
So that is all with the questions. We can go forward into Ilaria's Mazzoleni's new book, which is Transit of Coexistence, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the new book, and it touches upon some of these issues. It's not a book about architecture like the first one. So 10 years later, in a collaborative way, I developed a laboratory for multidisciplinary practices is named Nature, Art, and Habitat, and is a physical space where people come and do research and spend some time on topics of their own interest connected to the elements of nature. And from that laboratory of ideas, we developed this book that talks about some of the issues we discussed and others, but is really about how we coexist, right? And it cuts a transect in architecture. We cut sections, transects. We don't look just at the pretty picture. We look at what is behind, what is above, what is below. So it's this analytical look at the world, always not just an image, a pretty image for social media, but is more wanted to know more. So is my researcher at heart kind of desire to continue that I carry through other books. And in the case of Architecture Follows Nature, I involved a lot of students, plus Shona Price, of course, the biologist. In Nature, Art, and Habitat, the new book, we have been working with a greater amount of people, all the fellows that came to NAR, authors that wrote the book, and we are nine editors. So the family is growing and the dialogue is growing, and not in a very fast track, is slow and is deep, and it takes its time, but it creates a community of people that really put at the center environmental issues and the fact that we have this planet. This is the planet you and I will continue living on. Who knows in a few hundred years, but I think you and I, this is what we've got. So we want to treasure it.
Right. Thank you again, Ilaria, for sharing your insights and experiences with us today and your perspective on biomimicry and ideas behind architecture follows nature. Shows close design can learn from how closely design can learn from the natural world and help create more resilient cities. This is the end. Thank you to our listeners, and we hope that this conversation sparks some curiosity to explore more of biomimicry design into your own work or studies. And this has been the Carbon Countdown podcast. Thank you for tuning in and join us for our next segment to continue to explore innovative and approaches to sustainable design.